Dumelang. My name is Malatsi and I'm the DA's National Spokesperson. Today we are bringing you a special broadcast of the Minister's medium-term budget policy statement. This is a government statement where the government of the day outlines its priorities on spending and expenditure estimates. This policy statement comes at a time where many South Africans are struggling to cope with soaring food prices, with collapsing basic services, and also with struggles to put bread on the table. To join us for this special broadcast, we are joined by the DA Federal Leader, John Steenhuisen. John, what are your immediate reactions to the Minister's speech?
Well, sorry, my immediate reaction is that if you are a poor South African or a South African family that's really struggling to keep your head above water in a very difficult economic time, that there's not much there in this medium-term budget policy statement for you. It's almost like the minister was completely out of touch with the reality that many South Africans are feeling on a daily basis. Families who are unable to put food on the table, who are unable to afford transport costs due to rising petrol prices, and who are really suffering under massively growing inflation and downward pressure on this, not to mention unemployment. So one would expect if you are a state-owned entity like Denel that got bailed out today, that you'd be very happy. If you're a family that's struggling to make ends meet, there's not much cheer or, I would say, anything to be glad about in this particular budget, and that should worry us.
One of the issues you keep underscoring is the struggles that many poor South Africans face. And you have been consistent talking about the expansion of the VAT on zero-based food items. Why is that an important intervention?
Well, our interventions that we focused on the MTBPS this year was how we could bring immediate relief to homeowners, to households on the ground. What were the interventions that a caring government would make that would be able to make life easier for you, the citizen? And one of those was very clearly massively reducing the cost of food, which has spiraled out of control, particularly given the slow economic growth and the unemployment crisis in the country. And of course the recovery from the COVID-19 restrictions that destroyed large parts of our economy. One of the ways you do that is by cutting the cost of food. And one of the ways you can do that is by cutting the VAT on it. So one of the big interventions we made this year in proposals was removing VAT on bone-in chicken. That would immediately drop the price. It will mean that we could have a staple protein being able to be provided at a far cheaper price to ordinary South Africans. We did the costing on the basket of goods, which included baby formula, which included things like coffee, peanut butter, and other staples. And we showed very clearly that the net positive gain on that in terms of productivity and young students being able to study properly at school with food in their stomach far outweighed the negligible cost it would cost from cutting the VAT on that. These are the type of interventions we believe a caring government should be making. People at home do not eat ideology. They do not eat macroeconomic theory. They eat food that has spiraled out of control. They rely on transport where the petrol price has gone through the roof, and they rely on a government to intervene to assist them. This government has essentially sent the clear message today to ordinary South Africans struggling to keep their heads above water: we don't care. We're going to carry on regardless.
One of the things, John, that you keep talking about, and it was even mentioned in your Straight Talk column, the latest one, is that it is important to chart South Africa on the path of economic growth. Why is that an important element for the country's economy?
Because without economic growth, we're not going to have jobs, and we're not going to allow people to advance going forward. In my travels around South Africa, the majority of South Africans don't want to live on grants. They want jobs. They want the dignity of work, and they want to be able to provide for themselves and for their families. They want to be able to build a better future for their families. That is not possible without economic growth. And frankly, when we start talking about the 1.9% economic growth, which I think is in itself unrealistic, it's not enough to lift people out of poverty and into opportunity. It's not enough to unleash a jobs revolution in South Africa. We need to get this economy growing at 3 to 6% so we can start to absorb people into work. That is not going to happen without the fundamental reforms that are required to the way in which this economy is structured. And one of those things means walking away from state control of everything, about monopoly. And a good example is Eskom. This government just cannot get its head around letting go and allowing the private sector in to provide electricity, which is why we're sitting after 2 decades of promises from this government that things were going to change, with load shedding and job shedding and households that are unable to even keep the lights on at home. It's because this government won't make the hard reforms. It's easier to tax people more. It's easier to pretend poor people don't exist anymore than to actually grapple with the hard decisions that are required about cutting the size of government, cutting the cabinet, making sure that we have the private sector involved in as many aspects of the economy as possible, and making sure that we're unleashing opportunities for more South Africans. And until we have those reforms, we're going to continue to see this pathetic low-digit growth that we're seeing being perpetrated by this government. And that's why, clear message to South Africans, it doesn't have to be like this. 2024 is less than 18 months away. We can have a government that prioritizes growth. We can have a government that cares about you. And we can have a government that gets this economy moving in a jobs revolution. But it's going to come down to how people vote in that election.
And on that note, John, given all your observations and the level of disappointment in where the government came short, what is your final message to South Africans about today and going into the future?
Well, if you were ever under any illusion that this government has run out of ideas, they've run out of money, and they've run out of plans to make a future for you and your family, today was it. This was the line in the sand. Now it's up to us. This government's not coming to save us. This minister's out of his depth. This government has run out of money, and worst of all, they've stopped caring about you, the citizen at home. It's time for us to take back the initiative, and it's time for us as citizens now to start working determinedly to building a better future. And that starts with getting rid of this government and punishing them at the polls. If you look around the country, the way citizens express their unhappiness with the government is by voting them out. We've got to stand together, we've got to build a new majority, and we've got to vote this government out and vote a government in that's going to do the things that make a difference to you at home and make a difference in your lives. Not sitting, as we've seen today, with the endless streams of BMWs and endless numbers of cabinet ministers in and out of here who are pretending to be doing things that make a difference when in fact life's getting a lot harder for our people at home.
John, thanks very much for joining our special broadcast. And we will now be joined by the Chief Whip of the Democratic Alliance in the National Assembly, Siviwe Gwarube. Siv, why is today such an important day in Parliament and for the people who are watching at home?
It's an important day because I think there's often a misconception that Parliament is not the place for the people's business. And so days like this are an important occasion in the parliamentary calendar because it's an opportunity for the finance minister to essentially lay out what the plan is for government spending, for what the plan is for public money. And this is where South Africans come in. This institution, this budget, these ministers, these members of parliament are all people who report to you. It is your money, it is your institution. And so this is why it's important that South Africans take an interest in what happens in this institution, because it is in Parliament that decisions are made about whether or not to give you the relief that you need when it comes to the cost of living crisis, to give you the relief that you need when it comes to the cost of electricity, of transport and the like. And as John indicated, we have seen today that the priorities of this government are completely detached from the business of the people. What we have is a government that pretends that it is just simply governing out there and has no connection to the struggles of many South Africans. Because if it was a government that was connected, that was attached, that was concerned about the struggle of South Africans, they would have simply prioritized the issue of the cost of living. They should have prioritized the issue of load shedding and how we put an end to that, and actually put solutions in place about how we get there. But none of these things were discussed, and instead a lot of government bailouts were actually included, as opposed to bailing out South Africans. South Africans do not need another SOE bailed out. They need to be bailed out themselves and saved actually from poverty. And that's what we expected to see from the Minister of Finance today. But this is why days like this and this budget is important to South Africans, because they need to see exactly what it is that government is doing with your money in your institution.
You make a very important point about the cost of food prices. One of the things that the DA has been running is a campaign around cutting food costs. Why is that an important element for South Africans to be aware of in order to bring relief to them?
Because, of course, Ollie, what we've seen is that 7 out of 10 young people are unemployed. We've seen unprecedented unemployment levels. This government spends more servicing its debt than it does on education and healthcare. And that's a crisis. I mean, this is not just a government crisis, but this is now a humanitarian crisis. We've seen studies and statistics coming out, people saying families are starting to skip out on meals. We've seen child stunting on the rise. We've seen reports about learners going to school on a hungry stomach. What is happening here in South Africa is fast escalating into a humanitarian crisis. And what is the biggest tragedy of it all is that we are going to be raising another generation of young people that is going to be trapped in poverty for another 20, 30 years. And so the poor choices of this ANC government today are not just about the poor choices that they're making in 2022. It is also about a future generation of people who are going to be trapped by some of these poor choices, all because the ANC is absolutely dead set on serving itself, on serving its ideology, on making political considerations as opposed to making considerations for the people who put us in this institution. And so this is why cutting costs, the cost of living, is so critical. It is literally a matter of life and death for so many South Africans. And of course, these ministers don't have to worry about that, Solly, because they get driven around, they get houses in Pretoria and in Cape Town. They get all of these things provided for by your tax money. And it is the rest of us, and it's the rest of South Africans who have to pay for, electricity, who have to pay for paraffin, who have to pay for getting to and from work. It is them who feel the pinch. And it was for them that this budget was meant to be responding to, but it did not.
On that important note of fighting for future generations going into the next few months and the rest of the year, what are some of the things that the DA will be doing going forward to continue with this fight to bring relief to South Africans?
You see, of course, Solly, the other thing is that we're not just an opposition party that just simply sits in parliament to oppose. We take our role as the official opposition very seriously. That is why we came up with implementable solutions to say to government, here are the solutions. You don't have to credit us for it, but here are the 5 key things that you can do today to actually bring relief to South Africans. Extending the VAT list, the food items on the VAT list, stopping the aid to Cuba, and actually reinvesting that money back to relief for poor South Africans. In fact, I would have stood up and applauded the minister had he said that the 50 million rand that is on its way to Cuba was actually going to be redirected for relief for poor South Africans. But instead, none of those things were made. And so we're not going to stop there. We don't see our role as simply just opposing government, but we're going to continue making these proposals. We're going to continue saying to government that nothing about South Africans without them. And so also, South Africans have an opportunity. In 18 months' time, South Africans have an opportunity to fire a government that doesn't care about them. And I, for one, would really recommend that we do not shackle ourselves with an ANC government for another 5 years. I don't think any of us could afford it.
Siviwe, thank you very much for joining our broadcast. Please continue with the fight in Parliament and fighting for South Africans. We will now be joined by Ashor Sarupen, who is the DA's Deputy Minister on Finance. Ashor, welcome to our special broadcast.
Thank you very much, Sadi.
One of the things that the DA keep hovering around is, why do we continue to issue money to failed state-owned enterprises as if we have all of this money in the world? Is this government having its priorities in the right places?
Well, it's evident that they don't, because choosing state-owned enterprises over investing in the people of this country is a bad trade-off. So you're sacrificing housing, you're sacrificing healthcare, you're sacrificing education in favor of bailing out state capture money that was stolen from SOEs like Eskom, and we know what happened with the Guptas and Trillion Capital. You're also dealing with SAA and all of the issues there. And the reality is that you can have private electricity generation, you don't need to bail them out. The state doesn't need to own an airline, there's lots of airlines in the business. And so it's really not necessary. But what we are seeing is they're making very, very bad choices about who and what matters in this country, and they do that through the budget. They're telling us that their cadres on the boards of state-owned enterprises matter far more than the people of the country.
One of the trends that we are seeing globally is that most countries and most companies are actually tightening their belts, making sure that they save on unnecessary things and dedicate money into the right places. But this government continues to spend money on things such as sending 50 million to Cuba, 20 million on this vanity project of the flag. Why do you think that this government does not get that money needs to be directed in the right places?
Well, it's because they fundamentally believe that they get to choose on behalf of the people rather than listening to the people and what their needs are. And it's also because they are obsessed with vanity projects and showing off. They cannot help themselves. All that they know to do is pick what they think will make them look good over the needs of South Africans. And so you get this bizarre false sense of patriotism with the example of a gigantic flag for 20 million rand. That's not going to solve a single person's housing issue. It's not going to help someone access healthcare. It's not going to deal with the nutrition issues. And it tells you something about their priorities, that they choose that over something critical like expanding the VAT list so that we can have more people access protein because they can afford food.
The DA is very vocal about the importance of making sure that there is investment in infrastructure so that it can spare us in the direction of economic growth. Why is that spending on maintaining and ensuring that we've got the right infrastructure so important to the DA's reforms?
Yes, well, infrastructure is critical because that leads to growth. The more fixed infrastructure you have, the more you have this enabling environment where lots and lots of businesses can then invest and thrive. We know that our ports are some of the most inefficient in the world. We know that the rail system has collapsed. That makes it very difficult to get your goods to international markets. If you're a farmer wanting to get citrus fruits out of the country, you can't easily do that in this environment because the cost of transport is high because rail has collapsed, and because the ports are so inefficient, your fruit goes bad before you can sell it off to the Europeans or the Brits or the Australians or the Saudi Arabians, and it becomes a huge, huge blockage. So getting that infrastructure right is a boon for economic growth. Even electricity infrastructure, when a business doesn't have electricity for 2 hours a day, it cannot conduct business and therefore cannot grow, cannot hire more people because it's losing their productivity. If you could just get all those infrastructure issues fixed, you can unleash a lot of economic growth, get more people into jobs, fewer people on welfare, and you'll have better living standards for millions of South Africans.
Ashor, thanks very much for sharing your thoughts and some of the solutions that the DA has been bringing to the table. We will now be joined by Dion George, who is our Shadow Minister of Finance and has been at the forefront of leading some of this work that we are doing. Dion, welcome to this special broadcast in response to the Minister's budget speech. One of the things that the DA is very high on was bringing solutions to the table. And in fact, a few days ago and for the past few weeks, you have been very proactive in proposing solutions that the minister should take into consideration in order to bring relief to poor South Africans. Has he delivered on that?
No, the minister fell very short of expectations. We had several things that we wanted the minister to focus on today. If we look, for example, at growth, we have made proposals on how to grow our economy, especially make it easier for small, medium and micro enterprises, encourage entrepreneurship. There was nothing about that. All we saw today was that government remains fixated on its model to place the state at the center of our economy. So it's a developmental state model, but we have a dysfunctional government. We saw that in the bailouts. There's going to be 30 billion rand in additional bailouts. And that says that the idea of government that the state-owned enterprises can grow our economy is still there. We know it's not able to do that. We know no jobs will come from that. So it's the wrong model that they've chosen. So the minister fell way short of expectation on that. On the issue of debt, government has been saying that it's going to be reducing debt over the next 2 years. We saw completely the opposite. We saw now a transfer somewhere in the region of 126 billion to 260 billion rand will be transferred from Eskom's debt book onto the national balance sheet. which means that we're going to have to pay more interest, and it's going to crowd out service delivery, especially to the most vulnerable South Africans. So that made absolutely no sense from what government has been saying in terms of cutting the debt burden. The explanation that you basically blackmailing the population to say, well, if we don't put the debt onto the national balance sheet, the lights are going to go out. That is complete nonsense. The DA has a very significant and a very well thought out plan to rescue Eskom. For example, inject the private sector into Eskom and remove the moral hazard. Because what happens now is if you bail it out, you give it more money, you transfer the debt over, there is no incentive to be efficient. And that's the big problem. Also, starting up another Eskom isn't going to sort out the problem. So the DA, we know, has got a comprehensive plan, but the minister remains fixated on these large state-owned enterprises that will fail. Also, the most astounding thing today was the minister never mentioned a single word about the cost of living crisis in South Africa and the problems that South Africans are facing putting food onto the table. Not a single word. The DA has proposed the expansion of the zero-rated food basket. The minister said that he would look into that and that he would have a panel appointed if we asked. We've done that. We went to Pretoria the other day to make demands. We haven't heard a single word about that cost of living crisis. We do support the extension of the social relief of distress grant. The DA has proposed a conditional basic income grant of 585 Rand a month. So we do support that aspect. But the fact that the minister was completely silent on the crisis facing South Africans, hungry South Africans, is absolutely egregious. We also do support more money for the National Prosecuting Authority. We believe that is a problem. We don't want to have a grey listing next year, although it does look that it's likely to happen. So we do support that, but we know that the key thing is political will. What needs to happen is these transactions need to be identified, they need to be reported, and there needs to be action on them. And we know there's no political will on that. So on a whole, a very disappointing budget that fell well short of our expectations. Obviously, we will have an alternative budget in February and we'll carry on pushing in that direction. But it's a symptom of a broken government that has no clue on how to rescue our broken economy.
If you were to summarize the whole speech, what do you think was the major takeaway for South Africa from this speech?
I think the major takeaway from South Africa is that government doesn't care. Government does not care that there's a crisis in our economy. Government does not care that people are hungry, that people are starving, and that there's a cost of living crisis. Not a single word was said about that. And I think that's the most egregious thing. But I think what's wonderful about this whole thing is that the people know that in 2024 there's going to be an election, and they can actually fix this problem. They can actually remove this broken government and get South Africa onto a sustainable economic path. If we continue down this road, we are going to become a dismally failed state, and none of us want that. So the DA is very strong. We've got policies, we've got plans, and we will continue. The next thing we do after this is we start planning for February next year, because the day is going to come when the people are going to remember what the government did to them today. It never even acknowledged the fact that there is a crisis in the cost of living, and that is very egregious.
Dion, thanks very much for sharing your thoughts on that. I think you are the finance minister that South Africa deserves, and I hope South Africans who are watching at home understand the magnitude of the moment that we are in. In contrast to this budget speech, the DA has been very vocal, coming up with solutions to cut food prices, to reduce the cost of living, to bring relief to all of you so that we can bring the relief that we need, because not only do we care, but we also understand the suffering that you have to endure as you try to feed your families, as you try to get to places of work, and as you try to get by living. Thanks very much for joining this special broadcast. For other breaking news, keep following the DA on all our social media platforms. Thank you.